The gunshot echoed across the deserted street, but Xavier Norris didn't flinch as he lowered his smoking pistol. The would-be bandit crumpled to the dust at his feet, dead before he hit the ground. Xavier holstered his weapon and surveyed the town of Red Rock Springs with cold, vacant eyes that reflected nothing of the man he once was. "That's the third one this month," Sheriff Miller said, approaching with caution. "Reckon they'll stop coming after you now." Xavier said nothing. He never did any more. With a slight nod to the lawman, he mounted his chestnut stallion and rode out of town, leaving the sheriff to handle the body. The people of Red Rock watched him go, their expressions a mixture of fear and pity. The legendary gunslinger known as Silent Norris had saved their town more times than they could count, but not once in 2 years had they heard his voice. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as Xavier rode toward his small ranch nestled in the foothills. It wasn't much a modest cabin, a sturdy barn, and enough land to raise a few horses, but it was all he needed. All he deserved after everything that had happened. As dusk settled over the land, Xavier completed his evening routine with mechanical precision. He tended to his horses, checked his fences, and prepared a simple meal. When darkness enveloped the landscape, he sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey and stared into the void, as he did every night. The silence that surrounded him was both a punishment and a sanctuary. In that silence, he could still hear the screams, still see the flames that had consumed everything he'd once held dear. Sometimes he'd drink until the memories blurred, but they never disappeared completely. They were etched into his soul like brands on cattle. 30 miles east of Red Rock Springs, the stagecoach rattled violently as it hit another rut in the poorly maintained road. Inside, Willow Gardner clutched the edge of her seat, trying to maintain her composure as the vehicle bounced and swayed. "First time out west, miss?" asked the elderly gentleman seated across from her, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Is it that obvious?" Willow replied with a small smile, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "You've got that look about you, like everything's new and a bit frightening." "I suppose it is." "I've spent my whole life in Boston. What brings you all the way to Red Rock Springs? Not exactly a common destination for Eastern ladies." Willow's smile faltered slightly. "My uncle passed away. I'm his only living relative, so his property falls to me. My condolences." "Who was your uncle, if you don't mind me asking?" "Frederick Holloway. He owned a general store in town, I believe." The old man's eyebrows rose. "Old Fred? Well, didn't know he had family back east." "His store's still running. His clerk's been keeping it going since Fred passed 3 months ago." Willow nodded, grateful for the information. "I wasn't close with my uncle. My mother, his sister, passed when I was young, and he and my father didn't get along, but he remembered me in his will." The conversation faded as Willow turned her attention to the landscape outside. The vast, open spaces were unlike anything she'd seen before, beautiful in their wildness, yet somehow intimidating. After the confines of Boston society, where every aspect of a young woman's life was regulated and observed, the freedom of the West was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 23, Willow had resigned herself to spinsterhood after refusing 3 suitors her father had approved. Each man had been wealthy, respectable, and utterly dull. Her father's disappointment had been palpable, but Willow couldn't bring herself to marry without love, without passion. When the letter had arrived informing her of her inheritance, she'd seen it as a chance to escape the stifling expectations of Boston society. Her father had been furious, of course. "You'll be back within a month," he'd said dismissively, "when you've had your fill of dust and savages." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this journey was foolish. But as the stagecoach crested a hill and Willow caught her first glimpse of Red Rock Springs in the distance, something inside her stirred a sense that, despite everything, she was exactly where she needed to be. The stagecoach arrived in town just before sunset, pulling up to the modest station with a chorus of creaking wood and jangling harnesses. Willow stepped down carefully, her legs stiff from the long journey. The driver handed her the single trunk she'd brought, containing only the essentials she'd need to start her new life. Miss Gardner, a round-faced man with spectacles, approached her. "I'm Elias Porter. I've been running your uncle's store since his passing." "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Porter," Willow said, extending her hand. "I appreciate your dedication to my uncle's business." "It's been my pleasure, miss. Fred was a good man and a fair employer. The store's been my life for 15 years now." He gestured to a wagon nearby. "I've brought transportation for you and your belongings. I can take you to the store first or to your uncle's home if you prefer." "The home, please. It's been a long journey." As they rode through town, Elias pointed out various establishments: the saloon, the sheriff's office, the small schoolhouse. Red Rock Springs was nothing like Boston, but there was a certain charm to its frontier simplicity. People nodded greetings as they passed, curious about the newcomer. "That's your uncle's store," Elias said, indicating a well-maintained building with Holloway General Goods painted across the front. "It's the largest in town. Your uncle built a good reputation for fair prices and quality merchandise." Willow felt a twinge of pride. Though she'd never known Frederick Holloway, it seemed he'd been respected in this community. They continued to the edge of town where a modest but well-built two-story house stood. It was painted white with green shutters, and a small garden, though somewhat neglected, bordered the front path. "Your uncle lived alone, but he always kept this place nice," Elias explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "Mrs. Abernathy from town has been by once a week to dust and air it out. She left some food in the kitchen for you as well." Willow thanked him, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was alone in a strange town, thousands of miles from everything familiar. "Don't worry, Miss Gardner," Elias said, noting her expression. "Red Rock folks look after their own. And as Fred Holloway's niece, you're already one of us." His kindness brought unexpected tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. I'll come by the store tomorrow to discuss business matters." After Elias left, Willow explored the house that was now hers. It was comfortable if plain, with solid furniture and few personal touches. In the study, she found bookshelves filled with volumes on business, local history, and surprisingly, several novels she recognized. Perhaps she and her uncle would have had more in common than she'd realized. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the strange sounds of the prairie night, Willow wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But beneath the doubt was a current of excitement, a feeling that here, in this wild place, she might finally discover who she truly was. 3 weeks passed quickly as Willow settled into life in Red Rock Springs. Under Elias's patient guidance, she learned the workings of the general store, which proved more complex than she'd anticipated. Her education in Boston had included bookkeeping, however, and she found she had a natural aptitude for business. The townspeople initially regarded her with curiosity and some skepticism. An unmarried Eastern woman running a business was an oddity in the frontier town. But Willow's intelligence, work ethic, and genuine interest in her customers' lives gradually won them over. "You've got a good head for business, just like your uncle," Elias commented one evening as they tallied the day's receipts. "And the customers like you, even old Mrs. Henderson, and she doesn't like anybody," Willow laughed. "She told me my prices on sugar were highway robbery, but she bought 3 pounds anyway." "That's high praise from her," Elias said with a chuckle. "By the way, the supply wagon should arrive tomorrow. We're low on ammunition and coffee." "I'll handle it," Willow said confidently. She discovered she enjoyed the challenges of running the store, ordering inventory, negotiating with suppliers, helping customers find exactly what they needed. For the first time in her life, she felt useful, respected for her abilities rather than just her family name or appearance. The next morning, as predicted, the supply wagon arrived. Willow was checking the delivery against her order when Sheriff Miller entered the store. "Morning, Miss Gardner," he said, tipping his hat. "Getting settled in all right." "Good morning, Sheriff. Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very welcoming." "Glad to hear it." He glanced at the supplies being unloaded. "I see you ordered more ammunition, been selling a lot lately." Yes, actually. Is that a concern? The sheriff rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Not exactly. Just noticed some unfamiliar faces in town the past week. Probably nothing, but keep an eye out, will you? Let me know if anyone buys unusually large quantities. Of course, Willow agreed, feeling a flutter of unease. She'd heard stories of the lawlessness that sometimes plagued frontier towns, but Red Rock had seemed peaceful. After the sheriff left, Willow questioned Elias about his cryptic warning. The sheriff's cautious by nature, Elias explained, but he's usually right to be. There have been rumors of the Blackwater gang operating in the territory. They've hit several small towns south of here. Should I be worried? Just alert. Red Rock's better protected than most places, thanks partly to our sheriff and partly to... He hesitated. To what? Well, to Xavier Norris, though he'd never accept credit for it. Man doesn't say a word these days. Who is Xavier Norris? Elias lowered his voice, though the store was empty. Used to be a Texas Ranger, one of the best. Settled on a small ranch outside town about 2 years back. Doesn't socialize, doesn't talk, hence the nickname Silent Norris, but he's the fastest gun in 3 territories. Willow frowned. He sounds dangerous. He is to those who threaten innocent folks. 3 weeks ago he shot dead a man who tried to rob the bank. Did it clean and quick, then rode off without a word. He saved this town more than once, but he's damaged somehow. The story intrigued Willow. In Boston, men were judged by their family connections, their wealth, their social graces. This silent protector, judged only by his actions, represented everything different about the West. Does he ever come to town, to the store? She asked. Rarely. He's mostly self-sufficient. Comes in maybe once a month for supplies he can't produce himself. Due for a visit soon, actually. As if summoned by their conversation, the bell above the door jingled, and a tall figure entered the store. Willow's first impression was of contained power, a man who moved with the deliberate grace of a predator. He wore simple clothes, dusty from the trail, faded denim pants, a cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and a weathered leather vest. A revolver hung low on his hip, the holster worn from use. But it was his face that captured Willow's attention. Beneath the shadow of his hat, his features were striking, strong jaw darkened with stubble, straight nose, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something compelling about him, something that made it difficult for Willow to look away. Mr. Norris, Elias said with a nod. What can we help you with today? Xavier Norris didn't respond verbally. Instead, he handed Elias a folded paper, a list of supplies. His gaze swept the store, pausing briefly when it landed on Willow. There was no change in his expression, but for a moment she felt the weight of his assessment. This is Miss Willow Gardner, Elias said. Fred Holloway's niece from back east. She owns the store now. Xavier nodded once in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting Willow's directly for the first time. She felt a strange jolt, as if she'd touched something electric. There was such intensity in his gaze, such carefully controlled emotion. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Norris, Willow said, extending her hand without thinking. He looked at her offered hand for a moment, then back to her face. Slowly, as if the gesture was unfamiliar to him, he removed his glove and shook her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. Then he released her and turned back to Elias, who had begun gathering the items on his list. I'll help, Willow said, moving to collect the coffee and sugar Xavier had requested. As she worked, she found herself sneaking glances at the silent man. Despite his imposing presence, there was something profoundly sad about him. The lines around his eyes spoke of pain rather than laughter, and though he couldn't be more than 35, there was a weariness in his bearing that suggested he'd lived several lifetimes. When everything was gathered, Elias tallied the cost. Xavier placed the exact amount on the counter, then began loading his supplies into a saddlebag. Can I help you carry anything? Willow asked impulsively. Xavier paused, looking at her with what might have been surprise. He shook his head and lifted the heavy bags with ease. Be careful riding back, Elias called after him. Sheriff says there have been strangers about. Xavier nodded, his hand briefly touching the gun at his side, a gesture that said more clearly than words that he was always careful, always prepared. After he left, Willow found herself staring at the door. He wasn't always like that, Elias said quietly. What happened to him? Elias sighed. No one knows for certain. Some say he lost his family to raiders. Others think it was something from his ranger days. Whatever it was, it stole his voice along with his peace. That night, Willow couldn't get Xavier Norris out of her mind. There was something about him that called to her, not romantically, she told herself firmly, but out of compassion. She recognized loneliness when she saw it, having experienced it herself even in Boston's crowded parlors. But Xavier's isolation seemed self-imposed, a deliberate withdrawal from the world. Over the next 2 months, Willow threw herself into running the store and becoming part of the community. She joined the church ladies' auxiliary, helped organize a town social, and even began giving reading lessons to several adults who'd never had the opportunity to learn. The more she connected with the people of Red Rock, the more she felt she'd found her place in the world. Xavier Norris came to the store exactly once a month, always with the same routine. He would hand Elias or Willow a list, wait silently while his supplies were gathered, pay precisely, and leave with a nod. He never lingered, never engaged in conversation, though Willow always tried. "Lovely weather we're having," she'd remark, or "the new shipment of coffee just arrived yesterday." He would acknowledge her comments with a slight nod, but nothing more. Still, Willow persisted. There was something about the silent man that touched her heart, and she couldn't explain why even to herself. One afternoon in late summer, Willow was alone in the store when 3 rough-looking men entered. They weren't locals, and something about their manner immediately put her on edge. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice steady. "What can I help you with today?" The tallest man, with a jagged scar across one cheek, approached the counter. "Just passing through looking to resupply. You got ammunition for a Winchester?" "We do," Willow answered, moving toward the locked cabinet where they kept the bullets. "How many boxes would you like?" "5, the man said, his eyes never leaving her face. "And some whiskey if you've got it." "The saloon would be a better place for spirits," Willow replied. "We only carry medicinal alcohol." The scarred man leaned on the counter, invading her space. "That'll do fine, sweetheart." Willow's heart raced, but she maintained her composure as she retrieved the ammunition. "Will there be anything else?" "Information," said the second man, shorter but with cold, calculating eyes. "We heard there's a man around these parts, name of Xavier Norris. You know him?" Willow's hand stilled on the ammunition box. "He's a customer occasionally." "Where might we find him?" "I wouldn't know." "He doesn't socialize in town." The third man snorted. "Heard he doesn't talk at all, just shoots people." "Sounds like our man," the scarred leader said with a grim smile. "You tell him if you see him that Marcus Reeves is looking for him. He'll know the name." Willow nodded, her mouth dry. "Is that all for today?" The men paid for their purchases and left, but not before the leader gave Willow another long, assessing look that made her skin crawl. The moment they were gone, Willow hurried to the sheriff's office. "Marcus Reeves," Sheriff Miller repeated, his expression grave. "You're sure that's what he said?" "Positive. They were asking about Mr. Norris." The sheriff sighed heavily. "This is bad news, Miss Gardner. Reeves was part of a notorious gang in Texas, same one Xavier helped bring down during his ranger days. Reeves went to prison while the others hanged. Must have been released recently." "They seemed dangerous," Willow said. "They are. Reeves has a particular hatred for Xavier. His brother was among those executed." The sheriff stood, checking his gun. "I need to warn Xavier. Those men are likely headed to his ranch now." "I'm coming with you," Willow said impulsively. "No, madam, too dangerous. Mr. Norris saved my life once," she lied quickly. "I owe him this warning at least." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay close to me, and if there's trouble, you do exactly as I say." They rode quickly out of town, following the trail to Xavier's isolated ranch. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. Willow had never been so far from town before, and despite the circumstances, she couldn't help admiring the wild beauty of the terrain. "There it is," Sheriff Miller said as they crested a hill. Xavier's ranch was modest but well maintained. A small cabin, a barn, and several corrals for horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating he was home. As they approached, the sheriff slowed his horse. "Something's wrong," he muttered, drawing his gun. Willow saw it too. The front door of the cabin stood open, and there was no sign of movement. "Stay here," the sheriff ordered, dismounting. But before he could take 2 steps, gunfire erupted from the direction of the barn. Sheriff Miller fell instantly, clutching his leg. Willow's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing her, but she managed to control the animal and dismounted quickly, crouching beside the injured lawman. "It's just a graze," he gasped, though blood soaked his trouser leg. "But we're in their sights now." More shots rang out, forcing them to take cover behind a water trough. Willow's heart pounded in her ears as bullets splintered wood inches from her head. "Where's Xavier?" she whispered. "Don't know, could be dead already or pinned down like us." The firing paused and a voice called out, "That you, Sheriff? You should have stayed in town. This ain't your fight." "It became my fight when you came to my town, Reeves," the sheriff shouted back. "Where's Norris?" A cruel laugh answered him. Silent as ever. "Found him in the barn with his horses. He's putting up a hell of a fight for a man who won't speak." Relief flooded through Willow. Xavier was alive, at least for now. "Let the girl go," Sheriff Miller called. "She's got nothing to do with this. She's seen our faces. She stays." A bullet struck the trough, sending splinters flying. "You've got one chance, Sheriff. Ride back to town and forget what you saw here. We only want Norris. You know I can't do that, Reeves. Then you'll die with him." The gunfire resumed, more intense than before. The sheriff returned fire sparingly, conserving his ammunition. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," he told Willow grimly. "And I can't move well with this leg." Willow glanced around desperately, looking for some way out of their predicament. The sun had set now, darkness settling over the ranch. In the dim light, she saw movement near the barn, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. "Look," she whispered, pointing. The sheriff squinted in the direction she indicated. "It's Xavier," he breathed. "He's trying to circle behind them." Willow watched as Xavier moved silently from one piece of cover to the next, invisible to the men who were focused on their position. His movements were fluid, precise, the actions of a man who had done this many times before. "We need to keep them distracted," the sheriff said, firing another shot toward the barn. Inspiration struck Willow. "I have an idea." Before the sheriff could stop her, she called out, "Mr. Reeves, can we talk about this? There's no need for more bloodshed." The firing paused momentarily. "Who's that speaking? The girl?" "Yes," Willow replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm Willow Gardner. I own the general store in town. Whatever quarrel you have with Mr. Norris, surely we can resolve it without more violence." A harsh laugh answered her. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. Norris killed my brother. An eye for an eye, that's the only resolution I'm interested in." "Your brother was hanged legally after a trial," she countered, desperately trying to keep his attention as Xavier continued his approach. "Mr. Norris was just doing his job as a ranger. He hunted us like animals," Reeves shouted, anger making him careless. "He's going to pay for that and for everyone else he's killed." While Willow kept Reeves talking, Xavier had managed to position himself behind the barn. In a sudden burst of action, gunfire erupted from a new direction. Willow heard shouts of surprise and pain from Reeves's men. "He's behind us," someone yelled. The night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as shots came from multiple directions. Willow and the sheriff huddled behind their meager cover, unable to see clearly what was happening. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. An eerie silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the soft moaning of a wounded man. "Xavier," the sheriff called cautiously. "You still with us?" No verbal response came, but after a moment, a tall figure emerged from the shadows near the barn, moving toward them with a slight limp. "Norris," Sheriff Miller said with evident relief. "What's the situation?" Xavier held up 2 fingers, then pointed to the barn. "2 down. What about Reeves?" Xavier shook his head, pointing to the darkness beyond the buildings. "He got away," the sheriff cursed softly. "We need to get a posse together, track him before he gets too far." Xavier nodded in agreement, then turned his attention to Willow for the first time, his expression questioning. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands were shaking. "Not hurt at all." He studied her face for a moment, as if confirming her words, then nodded once before moving to check the sheriff's wound. "It's not bad," Sheriff Miller said as Xavier examined his leg. "Bullet just grazed me. I can ride back to town for help." Xavier shook his head firmly, gesturing toward his cabin. "You want us to stay here tonight?" the sheriff asked. Xavier nodded, pointing to the darkness and making a tracking motion with his hand. "You're right. Too dangerous to move now, and Reeves could be laying in wait. But first thing tomorrow, I need to organize a search party." Xavier helped the sheriff to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way to the cabin. Willow followed, still trembling from the ordeal. The simple structure was sparsely furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace that provided both heat and light. Xavier guided the sheriff to the only chair, then immediately began tending to his wound. His movements were efficient and practiced as he cleaned and bandaged the injury. Not once did he speak, communicating only through gestures and expressions. When he'd finished with the sheriff, Xavier turned to Willow, concern evident in his eyes as he gestured for her to sit on the edge of the bed. "I'm truly fine," she assured him. "Just shaken." He studied her carefully, then moved to the stove where a pot of coffee was keeping warm. He poured 3 cups, adding a splash of whiskey to each, and handed them around. "Thank you," Willow said, wrapping her cold hands around the warm mug. "Not just for the coffee, but for saving our lives out there." Xavier shrugged slightly, as if to say it was nothing. "It's not nothing," she insisted. "You risked your life for us. I'm grateful." Something flashed in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or discomfort with her gratitude. He turned away, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. "Reeves won't give up," Sheriff Miller said grimly. "He's waited too long for revenge." Xavier nodded in agreement, his expression hardening. "What exactly happened between you and Reeves?" Willow asked. The sheriff answered for him. Xavier was part of a special ranger unit tasked with bringing down the Reeves gang about 7 years ago. They'd been terrorizing communities across Texas, robbery, murder, worse. Xavier infiltrated the gang, gathered evidence, and when the time came, helped capture the lot of them. Xavier's back was to them as the sheriff spoke, his shoulders tense. Marcus Reeves got 15 years for his part. His brother Caleb, the gang's leader, was hanged along with 3 others. "I reckon Marcus blames Xavier for all of it, especially his brother's death." Willow watched Xavier, seeing how the words affected him even though he gave no outward reaction. "You were doing your duty," she said softly, "protecting innocent people from men like them." Xavier turned slightly, giving her a sidelong glance that held both acknowledgement and something deeper, a pain that went beyond this particular story. They spent an uneasy night at the cabin. Sheriff Miller dozed in the chair, his injured leg propped up on a stool. Xavier insisted Willow take the bed while he maintained a vigil by the window, gun ready. Despite her exhaustion, Willow found it difficult to sleep, too aware of Xavier's silent presence across the room, of the danger that still lurked in the darkness outside. When she did finally drift off, her dreams were troubled, filled with gunshots and shadowy figures. She woke with a start in the pre-dawn light, momentarily disoriented. Sheriff Miller was still asleep in his chair, but Xavier was gone. Alarmed, Willow rose quietly and moved to the window. Outside, the ranch was quiet, shrouded in early morning mist. Then she spotted him. Xavier was in the corral with a young bay horse, moving in slow, gentle circles around the animal. There was something mesmerizing about the way he worked, his body language calm and assured as he gradually approached the skittish colt. Willow slipped outside, drawn by the peaceful scene after the violence of the previous night. She stood at the corral fence, watching as Xavier held out his hand to the young horse. The animal sniffed cautiously, then allowed Xavier to stroke its muzzle. "He's beautiful," Willow said softly. Xavier glanced her way, nodding in agreement. He patted the horse's neck, then walked toward her, stopping on the other side of the fence. "You have a way with them," she continued. "They trust you." A hint of something that might have been a smile touched his lips. He looked back at the colt, genuine affection in his expression. "Do they all have names?" Willow asked, gesturing to the several horses in the corral and pasture beyond. Xavier nodded, pointing to each animal in turn and then tracing letters in the air with his finger. "Thunder," Willow said, following his gesture. "And that one is Storm." "Do they all have weather names?" He nodded, looking faintly amused. "And the colt," Xavier traced more letters. "Promise," Willow read. "That's lovely." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind since yesterday. "Mr. Norris, why did you come to our aid yesterday?" "You could have hidden, let Reeves believe you weren't here." The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a seriousness that made her regret the question. But after a moment he pointed to her, then to the sheriff, and made a protective gesture, drawing an imaginary circle around them. "You were protecting us," Willow translated, "but you put yourself at risk to do so." Xavier shrugged slightly, as if to say it was the only choice he could have made. Before she could respond, Sheriff Miller's voice called from the cabin. "Miss Gardner, Norris." "We're here," Willow called back, turning to see the sheriff limping toward them, his face drawn with pain. "We need to get back to town," he said grimly. "Organize a search party for Reeves before he can cause more trouble." Xavier nodded in agreement, then held up a hand in a wait gesture before heading to the barn. He returned minutes later leading 3 saddled horses. "You're coming with us?" the sheriff asked, surprised. Xavier nodded firmly. "Good. I could use your tracking skills, and frankly, you're safer with us than alone out here." They rode back to town, Xavier leading the way, constantly scanning the landscape for signs of danger. Willow found herself studying him as they traveled. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed before: a long scar along his jawline, the threads of silver in his dark hair, the way his eyes never stopped moving, always alert. When they reached Red Rock, their arrival caused an immediate stir. The sight of the sheriff wounded, accompanied by the reclusive Xavier Norris and Miss Gardner, drew townspeople into the street with questions and concerns. "Reeves' gang," Sheriff Miller announced, addressing the gathering crowd from horseback. "At least one of them is still in the area. I need volunteers for a search party, armed men who can ride." Several men stepped forward immediately, including Elias Porter, who looked relieved to see Willow safe. "Miss Gardner was incredibly brave," the sheriff told Elias, "kept her head in a gunfight and helped save my life." Willow flushed at the praise. "It was Mr. Norris who saved us both," she corrected. She turned to thank Xavier, only to discover he had already dismounted and was handing his horse's reins to a stable boy. Without a word to anyone, he turned and began walking toward the saloon. "Xavier," Sheriff Miller called after him, "we'll gather at the office in an hour to start the search." Xavier raised a hand in acknowledgement without looking back. "Will he really help?" Elias asked quietly as they watched him go. "He's never joined a posse before." "This is personal for him," the sheriff replied. "Reeves has a grudge that goes back years. Xavier won't rest until the man's caught." He turned to Willow. "Miss Gardner, I'd like you to stay close to town for now. Reeves saw you with us. He might think you're important to Xavier." "Important to him?" Willow repeated, confused. "But we barely know each other." The sheriff gave her a measured look. "Xavier hasn't ridden into danger for anyone since he came to Red Rock. Yesterday he did it for us, for you. That makes you a target." The realization was sobering. "I'll be careful," she promised. An hour later, a posse of 12 men, including Xavier and the sheriff, despite his injury, rode out of town in pursuit of Marcus Reeves. They returned 3 days later, empty-handed and frustrated. "Trail went cold at the river," Sheriff Miller reported to Willow when she inquired. "Reeves knows how to disappear. Xavier tracked him farther than any of us could have, but even he lost the signs eventually. Do you think Reeves has left the territory? Maybe. But my gut says he's just biding his time, waiting for another chance at Xavier." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I've sent telegrams to neighboring towns warning them to be on the lookout." Life in Red Rock gradually returned to normal over the next few weeks, though there remained an undercurrent of tension. Xavier did not return to his ranch, choosing instead to stay in a room above the saloon, where he could keep watch over the town. He still didn't speak, but he was seen more frequently on the streets of Red Rock, his presence both reassuring and intimidating to the townsfolk. He visited the general store more often as well, sometimes with a list of supplies, sometimes seemingly without purpose. Willow always greeted him warmly, engaging in one-sided conversations that he acknowledged with nods or the occasional, almost smile. "You know," she told him one quiet afternoon as he examined a new shipment of gun oil, "in Boston, it would be considered terribly rude not to respond when someone speaks to you." Xavier looked up, raising an eyebrow in what might have been amusement. "Fortunately for you," Willow continued, encouraged by his reaction, "we're not in Boston, and I've never been one for rigid social rules anyway." He set down the bottle he was holding and, to Willow's surprise, removed a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He wrote briefly, then slid the notebook across the counter to her. "Lucky for me," she read aloud, the words neat and precise. She looked up at him, delighted. "So you can communicate when you choose to." Xavier retrieved the notebook, wrote again, and passed it back. "When necessary," Willow read. "But you'd rather not," he nodded, taking back the notebook and tucking it away. "Well, Mr. Norris, I respect your preference for silence, but I want you to know that if you ever do feel the need for conversation, even the written kind, I'm always willing to listen." She smiled at him, or Reed, as the case may be. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his habitual tension. He nodded once, the gesture conveying gratitude more clearly than words could have. After that day, a tentative friendship began to form between them. Xavier still didn't speak, but occasionally he would write a brief note in response to something Willow said, or to ask about a particular item in the store. These small interactions became something she looked forward to, bright spots in her busy days. As autumn progressed, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light to the prairie, Red Rock Springs prepared for its annual harvest festival. Despite the lingering concern about Marcus Reeves, the townspeople were determined to maintain their traditions. "You should come to the festival," Willow told Xavier when he stopped by the store a few days before the event. "There will be food, music, dancing." He gave her a skeptical look, shaking his head slightly. "Just for a little while," she pressed. "It would mean a lot to the town." "To me," she added impulsively. Xavier studied her face for a long moment, then slowly nodded his agreement. The day of the festival dawned clear and crisp. The town square had been transformed with decorations, colorful banners, hay bales for seating, tables laden with food contributed by every household. A makeshift stage held a band of local musicians, and children ran excitedly between the various activities. Willow wore her finest dress for the occasion, a deep blue garment that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. As one of the town's business owners, she had helped organize the event and was kept busy ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was mid-afternoon when she spotted Xavier at the edge of the celebration, standing apart from the crowds, observing. He'd made an effort with his appearance, she noted with pleasure. His clothes were clean, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. He still wore his gun, but so did most of the men present. Willow made her way to his side. "You came," she said, unable to hide her delight. He nodded, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the festivities. "Let me show you around," she offered, impulsively taking his arm. Xavier stiffened momentarily at her touch, then relaxed, allowing her to guide him through the festival. They sampled pies from the baking contest, watched children playing games, and observed the craftsmen displaying their wares. Throughout, Xavier remained silent, but Willow could feel him gradually unwinding beside her, his rigid posture softening as the afternoon progressed. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. The band struck up a lively tune, and people began to gather for dancing. "Miss Gardner," called Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who constantly complained about Willow's prices, "aren't you going to dance? A young lady shouldn't be standing on the sidelines." "I'm enjoying the company where I am," Willow replied with a smile, conscious of Xavier beside her. "Nonsense. Mr. Matthews over there has been looking for a partner. Go on, now." Before Willow could protest further, Xavier surprised her by producing his notebook. He wrote quickly, then showed her the message. "You should dance if you want to." "I'd rather stay with you," she answered honestly. He hesitated, then wrote again. "I don't dance anymore, she echoed. "So you used to." A shadow passed over his face. He put the notebook away without responding. "I'm sorry," Willow said softly. "I didn't mean to pry." Xavier shook his head slightly, as if dismissing her apology as unnecessary. He gestured toward the dancing couples, then back to her, his meaning clear. He was giving her permission to join them without him. "Maybe later," she said firmly. "Right now, I'd like to show you the view from the church bell tower. It's quite spectacular at sunset." He followed her to the small church at the edge of the square. The bell tower was accessible by a narrow staircase, and at the top was a platform that offered a panoramic view of Reed Rock Springs and the surrounding landscape. "I discovered this spot my first week in town," Willow told him as they gazed out at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I come here sometimes when I need to think, or just to remind myself how vast and beautiful the world is." Xavier leaned against the railing beside her, his expression more peaceful than she'd ever seen it. In the dying light, the hard lines of his face softened, revealing the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had silenced him. They stood in companionable silence as darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead. From below came the sounds of the festival music, laughter, the occasional cheer when someone won a game. "Thank you for coming today," Willow said at last. "I know it couldn't have been easy for you." Xavier turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. He reached for his notebook, hesitated, then wrote a single sentence. "You make difficult things easier." The simple words touched Willow deeply. "I'm glad," she replied softly. "You deserve some ease in your life, Xavier." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it seemed to affect him. He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, then abruptly turned back to the view, his posture tense once more. They remained in the tower until the chill of the night air drove them back down to the festival. By the time they returned, the celebration was beginning to wind down. Families with young children were heading home, though the dancing continued for those with more stamina. Miss Gardner. Sheriff Miller called, limping toward them. His leg had healed enough for him to walk without assistance, though he still favored it slightly. "We've been looking for you. The committee wants to announce the winners of the various contests." "Of course," Willow replied. She turned to Xavier. "Will you wait for me? I won't be long." He nodded, gesturing for her to go ahead. The announcements took longer than expected. By the time Willow was free again, she couldn't find Xavier anywhere in the square. Disappointed, she asked several people if they'd seen him. The silent feller. "Saw him heading toward the saloon about 20 minutes ago," one of the ranch hands told her. Willow debated whether to follow him. It was getting late, and a respectable woman had no business entering a saloon, especially alone. But she was reluctant to end the evening without saying goodbye, not when they'd shared such a pleasant time together. Decision made, she walked purposefully to the Red Dog Saloon at the end of the main street. The establishment was busy, filled with men unwinding after the festival. Conversations faltered as she entered, surprised faces turning to stare at the unexpected female presence. She spotted Xavier immediately. He sat alone at a corner table, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, his eyes fixed on the entrance. When he saw her, he straightened, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. Ignoring the whispers and stares, Willow made her way directly to his table. "You left," she said, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. Xavier reached for his notebook, but before he could write anything, a commotion near the bar drew everyone's attention. "Well, look what we have here," drawled a familiar voice that sent ice through Willow's veins. "A touching reunion." Marcus Reeves stood at the bar, a gun in his hand pointed directly at Xavier. He looked thinner and more ragged than when Willow had last seen him, with several weeks' growth of beard and wild eyes that spoke of obsession. "Nobody move," Reeves ordered as several men instinctively reached for their weapons. This is between me and Silent Norris here, he gestured with his gun. Stand up, Norris. Time to finish what started in Texas. Xavier rose slowly, his body tense but his face expressionless. He moved slightly, positioning himself between Reeves and Willow. Touching, Reeves sneered. Protecting the lady. Does she know what kind of man you really are, Norris? Does she know how many men you've killed? Xavier remained impassive, his eyes never leaving Reeves's face. I've been watching you, Reeves continued, taking a step closer. Watching you play the hero in this pathetic little town, watching you get close to the pretty shopkeeper. His gaze flicked to Willow, who stood frozen behind Xavier. Does she know you got your own family killed, Norris? That your wife and daughter died because of your arrogance? A muscle twitched in Xavier's jaw, the only sign that the words had struck home. That's right, Reeves said, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. I did my research while I was in prison. Found out all about Ranger Norris's tragic loss. How the Comancheros you were hunting found your homestead while you were away, how they left nothing but ashes. Willow felt sick at the cruelty of Reeves's words, at the pain they must be causing Xavier. Yet he stood unmoving, giving no outward indication of the wounds being reopened. You took my brother from me, Reeves said, raising his gun, an eye for an eye. Everything happened in an instant. Reeves's finger tightened on the trigger as Xavier's hand moved to his holster. Gunshots exploded in the confined space of the saloon, the sound deafening. Willow screamed, unable to see clearly through the sudden cloud of gunsmoke. When the air cleared, Reeves lay on the floor, a bullet hole in the center of his chest. Xavier remained standing, though blood spread across his left shoulder where Reeves's shot had struck him. Xavier, Willow cried, rushing to his side as he swayed slightly. He looked down at her, pain and something else, relief perhaps, in his eyes. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed into her arms, his weight bearing them both to the floor. Get the doctor, Willow shouted to the stunned onlookers. Hurry! Everything became a blur of activity. Men carried Xavier to the doctor's house, where Willow insisted on staying despite the impropriety. Dr. Peterson worked quickly to remove the bullet and stop the bleeding, his experienced hands efficient but gentle. The bullet missed anything vital, he told Willow when the operation was complete. He's lost blood, but he's strong. With rest and care, he should recover fully. Thank you, doctor, Willow said, sinking into a chair beside Xavier's bed. I'll stay with him tonight. Dr. Peterson raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As you wish, Miss Gardner. Call me if his condition changes. Left alone with the unconscious Xavier, Willow finally allowed her emotions to surface. Tears streamed down her face as she took his hand in hers, overwhelmed by everything that had happened and everything she'd learned, a wife and daughter, a family lost to violence. No wonder he had withdrawn from the world, abandoned speech, sought solitude. The pain must have been unbearable. I'm so sorry, Xavier, she whispered, stroking his hand. So sorry for what you've endured. She stayed by his side throughout the night, dozing occasionally in the uncomfortable chair, but always waking at the slightest sound or movement. Dawn was breaking when Xavier finally stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked disoriented at first, then focused on Willow's face. Recognition dawned, followed by a question in his eyes. Reeves is dead, she told him softly. You were shot, but the doctor says you'll recover completely. Relief washed over his features. He tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Don't, Willow urged, gently pressing him back. You need to rest. Xavier shook his head stubbornly, reaching for the small notebook that someone had placed on the bedside table. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, You shouldn't be here, not proper. Willow smiled faintly. I've never been very concerned with propriety. Besides, you were injured saving my life. Again, the least I can do is make sure you're all right, he wrote again. Reeves, what he said. About your family, Willow asked gently. Xavier nodded, pain shadowing his eyes. You don't need to explain anything to me, she assured him. What happened in your past is your own business. He shook his head, writing more determinedly now. You should know if we are to be friends. Willow's heart skipped at the word friends. All right, she said, but only if you're sure. Xavier took a deep breath, then began to write, filling page after page of the small notebook with his neat, precise handwriting. He paused occasionally, struggling with certain parts of the story, but persevered until he had recorded the essential facts. When he finally handed Willow the notebook, she read it carefully, her heart aching for him with each word. He had indeed been a Texas Ranger, one of their most effective operatives in combating border violence. He had married young to his childhood sweetheart, Sarah, and they had a daughter, Emma. While he was away on a mission to stop the Reeves gang, a group of Comancheros had attacked his homestead. By the time he returned, his home was burned to the ground, his wife and 6-year-old daughter dead. Consumed by grief and guilt, Xavier had thrown himself into tracking down every member of the Comanchero band, hunting them across Texas and the territories. He had killed them all one by one, but found no peace in their deaths. When the last man was dead, Xavier had discovered he had nothing left, no purpose, no voice, no desire to continue living. He had wandered aimlessly until reaching Red Rock Springs, where he had found a measure of solitude, if not peace. He had stopped speaking because words seemed pointless, inadequate to express the depths of his loss or to connect with a world that no longer held meaning for him. The final lines of his account read, "I exist, but I stopped living the day they died, until recently." Willow looked up from the notebook, tears in her eyes. "Until recently," she repeated softly. Xavier met her gaze steadily, then wrote one more sentence, "Until you laughed." Confused, Willow tilted her head questioningly. He elaborated, "At the festival, your laugh." "First time I've truly heard laughter in years," understanding dawned. During the festival, there had been a moment when one of the children had done something amusing, and Willow had laughed spontaneously, the sound bright and uninhibited. She hadn't realized Xavier had been affected by it. "My laugh woke you?" she asked, echoing the metaphor. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. The door opened before Willow could respond, and Dr. Peterson entered to check on his patient. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Norris," he said briskly. "How's the pain?" Xavier shrugged his good shoulder indifferently. "I'll give you something for it anyway," the doctor said, preparing a dose of medicine. "Miss Gardner, you should go home and rest. Mr. Norris is out of danger now." "I'll come back this afternoon," she promised Xavier, reluctant to leave but aware that she was wearing the same dress from the festival, now stained with his blood. He nodded, his eyes conveying what his voice could not. News of the confrontation at the saloon spread quickly through Red Rock Springs. By the time Willow returned to the general store, Elias had already heard multiple versions of the events. "They're saying Xavier Norris saved the whole town from Reeves," he told her excitedly. "And that you never left his side all night. Is he going to be all right?" "He will be," Willow confirmed, touched by the genuine concern in Elias's voice. "The doctor says the wound isn't serious." Good. He's a good man for all his peculiarities. This town owes him a debt." "Yes," Willow agreed softly. "We do." Over the following week, as Xavier recovered at the doctor's house, a steady stream of townspeople stopped by with gifts and well wishes. Most had previously avoided the silent gunman, intimidated by his reputation and aloofness. But his actions against Reeves had transformed him in their eyes from a frightening outsider to a heroic protector. Xavier accepted their gratitude with awkward nods, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but making an effort to be gracious. Willow visited every day, bringing books to read aloud to him and updates on town happenings. Their friendship deepened through these quiet hours, communication flowing more easily between them despite Xavier's continued silence. When Dr. Peterson finally declared him well enough to leave, Xavier faced a decision. His ranch had stood empty for weeks now, and while neighbors had looked after the horses, the place needed attention. "You could stay in town a bit longer," Willow suggested as they walked slowly from the doctor's house toward the hotel. Xavier's arm was in a sling, and he still moved carefully to avoid jarring his healing shoulder. "At least until you've regained your strength." He shook his head, writing in his notebook, "Need to check on the horses, get back to work." "Of course," Willow said, trying to hide her disappointment. She had grown accustomed to seeing him daily, to their quiet companionship. "Will you come into town sometimes?" Xavier studied her face for a moment, then wrote, "Would you like me to?" "Yes," she answered honestly, "very much." He nodded once, a promise in the gesture. True to his word, Xavier began making regular trips into Red Rock Springs. He would come to the general store, ostensibly for supplies, but would linger longer each time, sometimes helping Willow with heavy items or repairs around the building. Often, he would bring small gifts, wild flowers he'd found on the prairie, a particularly fine piece of wood he'd carved into a simple but beautiful box, fresh honey from the hives he kept at his ranch. As winter settled over the land, bringing shorter days and cold winds that swept across the prairie, these visits became the highlights of Willow's weeks. She found herself looking forward to them with an anticipation that went beyond mere friendship, though she tried to temper her feelings, uncertain of what Xavier might want or be capable of after his tragic past. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered at the church for a special service. Willow had expected Xavier to avoid such a public, communal event, but to her surprise and delight, he appeared just as the service was beginning, slipping quietly into the pew beside her. "You came," she whispered, unable to contain her smile. He nodded, glancing around somewhat uncomfortably at the crowded church, but settled in beside her nonetheless. The service was beautiful candles lighting the small space, familiar carols sung with enthusiasm if not always perfect pitch, the age-old story of hope born in darkness. Throughout, Willow was acutely aware of Xavier beside her, of the warmth of his presence in the cold night. After the final blessing, people lingered to exchange Christmas wishes and small gifts. Xavier seemed ready to flee the socializing, but Willow gently caught his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "I have something for you." From her pocket, she drew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's not much," she added as she placed it in his hands. Xavier looked surprised and somewhat dismayed. He shook his head, gesturing to indicate he had nothing to give in return. "I don't want anything," Willow assured him, "except for you to open it." Carefully, he unwrapped the package to reveal a new notebook, bound in soft leather with his initials embossed on the cover. Accompanying it was a fine silver pencil. "I noticed your old one was almost full," Willow explained, "and I thought perhaps you might have more to say." Xavier traced the initials with his finger, then opened the notebook to the first blank page. He hesitated for a moment before writing, "Thank you. No one has given me a gift in years." The simple statement, so honest in its loneliness, touched Willow deeply. "Well, that's a shame," she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the emotion welling in her throat. "You deserve good things, Xavier." He looked at her then, his eyes conveying what words could not: gratitude, affection, and something more complicated that made her heart beat faster. Their moment was interrupted by Sheriff Miller, who approached with a friendly clap on Xavier's shoulder. "Good to see you at church, Norris. Town's not the same without you keeping an eye on things." Xavier nodded in acknowledgement of the compliment. "Miss Gardner," the sheriff continued, turning to Willow, "the ladies have organized refreshments in the meeting hall. They were hoping you'd help serve." "Of course," she replied, though reluctant to leave Xavier's side. "Will you come too?" she asked him. He shook his head, writing quickly, "Need to get back to the ranch. Animals need tending. Even on Christmas Eve," she asked, disappointed. "Especially then," he wrote with the ghost of a smile. "Will you come for Christmas dinner tomorrow at my house? Nothing formal, just—" Willow hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "Just us." Xavier looked surprised by the invitation, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded his acceptance. 2 o'clock, she suggested. He nodded again, then hesitated before writing one more note. "I might have a gift for you by then." Willow's heart lifted at the words. "I'll look forward to it," she said softly. After he left, Willow found it difficult to concentrate on her duties with the refreshments. Her mind kept returning to Xavier's expression when he'd opened her gift, to the promise of seeing him again tomorrow, to the possibility that he might have feelings for her that matched her growing affection for him. "You're sweet on him, aren't you, Mrs.?" Henderson observed bluntly as Willow absently handed her a cup of punch. Startled from her reverie, Willow nearly dropped the ladle. "I beg your pardon, on Norris. Don't deny it, girl. I'm old, not blind. You light up like a Christmas candle whenever he's near." Willow felt a blush creeping up her neck. "Mr. Norris is a friend. He's been through a great deal, and I admire his strength." Mrs. Henderson said skeptically. "Well, he's a decent man underneath all that brooding, I'll give you that, but he's damaged goods, girl. Some hurts don't heal." "With respect, Mrs. Henderson, I believe all hurts can heal with time and care, even the deepest ones." The elderly woman studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right. Lord knows that man deserves some happiness after what he's endured." She patted Willow's hand. "Just be patient with him. Men are stubborn creatures at the best of times." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the prairie landscape transformed by a light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. Willow rose early, excited and nervous about Xavier's visit. She spent the morning preparing a special meal: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie for dessert. At precisely 2 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Xavier standing on her porch, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed, and in his arms was a large package wrapped in plain cloth. "Merry Christmas," Willow said warmly, stepping back to invite him in. "Please come inside, it's freezing out there." Xavier entered, glancing around her home with interest. It had changed significantly since she'd inherited it, now filled with books, colorful cushions, small treasures she'd collected since arriving in Red Rock. It was a home that reflected her personality: welcoming, vibrant, thoughtful. "Let me take your coat," she offered, helping him remove it without disturbing his package. "Something smells wonderful, doesn't it? I hope you're hungry." Xavier nodded, following her into the dining room where the table was set for two with her best china and a centerpiece of evergreen branches and candles. He placed his package carefully on a side table before taking the seat she indicated. The meal passed pleasantly. Though Xavier didn't speak, communication flowed between them through his expressions, gestures, and occasional written notes. Willow found herself talking more than usual, sharing stories from her childhood in Boston, her dreams for the future of the store, her observations about their neighbors in Red Rock. "I'm talking too much," she said at last, setting down her fork. "I'm sorry, I tend to fill silences." Xavier shook his head, writing in his new notebook. "I like listening to you, your voice is soothing." The simple compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. "Thank you, that's kind of you to say." After they'd finished the apple pie, Xavier rose and retrieved his package from the side table. He placed it before her with a slightly nervous expression. "For me?" Willow asked, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to bring anything." He shrugged, gesturing for her to open it. Carefully, Willow unwrapped the cloth to reveal a stunning quilt, handmade with intricate patterns in shades of blue, green, and gold that complemented the colors of her home perfectly. "Oh, Xavier," she breathed, running her fingers over the delicate stitching. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" He nodded, writing, "My mother taught me, said every home needs a good quilt." "I didn't know you could sew," Willow said, amazed by the craftsmanship. "This must have taken weeks." "Months," he corrected in writing. "Started after the festival, wasn't sure I'd give it to you." "Why not?" He hesitated, then wrote, "Wasn't sure it was appropriate. Quilts are personal." Willow understood what he was trying to say. Quilts were traditional gifts from suitors to their intended brides, symbols of warmth and protection, of a shared future. By giving her such a gift, Xavier was making a statement about his feelings, however tentatively. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received," she told him honestly. "I will treasure it always." Relief and pleasure mingled in his expression. He wrote again, "There's something else." From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn envelope and handed it to her. Inside, Willow found a single sheet of paper covered in writing more than she'd ever seen from him at one time. "May I read it now?" she asked. Xavier nodded, though he looked nervous, almost vulnerable as he waited for her to unfold the letter. "Dear Willow," she read silently. Words don't come easily to me anymore, but you deserve more than my silence. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. When I came to Red Rock, I was a ghost. I moved through the days without feeling, without purpose. I didn't speak because I had nothing to say, nothing that mattered. The world had taken everything from me, and I had nothing left to give it in return. Then you arrived with your bright eyes and your kind heart. You spoke to me even when I didn't respond. You saw something in me that I thought was long dead. You made me want to live again, not just exist. I don't have much to offer you. My ranch is small, my prospects limited. I carry scars that may never fully heal, but if you would consider it, I would like to court you properly, to see if there might be a future for us together. I understand if you decline. You deserve someone whole, someone who can give you the life you should have. But know that, regardless of your answer, you have given me back my humanity, and for that I will always be grateful. With deepest affection, Xavier. Willow looked up from the letter, tears glistening in her eyes. Xavier watched her anxiously, his hands clenched tightly together on the table. Yes, she said simply. He blinked, as if unsure he'd understood. Yes, I would like you to court me, Willow clarified, reaching across the table to take his hand. Very much. Relief and joy transformed Xavier's face, erasing years of grief in an instant. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it to write. I might never speak again. Would that bother you? No, Willow answered truthfully. You communicate more clearly with your silence than many men do with endless words. I hear you, Xavier. I've always heard you. He nodded, gratitude in his eyes, then wrote one more question. May I kiss you? I understand if it's too soon. In answer, Willow rose from her chair and moved around the table to stand before him. Xavier stood as well, towering over her slight frame. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he raised a hand to cup her cheek. Willow leaned into his touch, her heart racing as he bent down to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, hesitant at first, then deepening as Willow responded. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Well, Willow said softly, a smile playing at her lips, that was worth waiting for. A matching smile, the first true smile she'd ever seen from him, lit Xavier's face, transforming it completely. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing Red Rock Springs in pristine white. But inside Willow's home, warmth and hope bloomed like flowers in spring. The courtship of Willow Gardner and Xavier Norris became the talk of Red Rock Springs. Some approved, seeing it as a natural progression of their friendship and a chance for healing for the troubled gunman. Others worried that Willow was making a mistake, tying herself to a man so deeply scarred by his past. Willow paid little attention to the gossip. She was too busy discovering the joy of being with Xavier, of watching him gradually emerge from his shell under the influence of her affection. Though he still didn't speak, their communication deepened in other ways. They developed a kind of private language of gestures and expressions that allowed them to understand each other with minimal need for writing. When words were necessary, Xavier used his notebook, his written voice becoming more expressive and personal as their relationship progressed. They spent as much time together as their respective responsibilities allowed. Xavier helped at the store when deliveries arrived, using his strength to move heavy crates and his meticulous nature to organize inventory. Willow visited his ranch on weekends, learning to ride the gentle mare he had trained especially for her and helping with the various tasks required to keep the place running. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers across the prairie. One warm Sunday, Xavier took Willow on a picnic to his favorite spot, a secluded area near a creek where cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. They sat on the quilt he had made for her, enjoying a simple meal and the beauty of the day. I love it out here, Willow said, leaning back on her hands to look up at the cloud-scattered sky. It's so peaceful. I understand why you chose this land for your ranch. Xavier nodded in agreement, his expression serene as he gazed at the flowing creek. He picked up his notebook and wrote, It reminded me of home, before. Willow understood he meant his first home with Sarah and Emma. She had learned to recognize when he needed to talk about them, to share memories that had been locked inside him for too long. Tell me about them, she said gently. Xavier hesitated, then wrote for several minutes, describing how Sarah had loved to sing while she worked, how Emma had been fascinated by butterflies and would follow them around the yard with careful, deliberate steps. "They sound wonderful," Willow said when he finished. "You must miss them terribly." He nodded, a familiar shadow passing over his face. Then he wrote something that surprised her. "I think they would have liked you." Touched beyond words, Willow reached for his hand. "I would have liked them too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands intertwined, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Xavier began writing again, more hesitantly this time. "I've been thinking, the ranch is too big for just me, the house too empty." Willow's heart quickened. "What are you saying, Xavier?" He took a deep breath, then met her eyes directly as he wrote. "Marry me, Willow, be my wife, help me fill that emptiness with something new." Joy surged through her, but she needed to be certain. "Are you sure? I know how much Sarah meant to you. I would never want to replace her in your heart." Xavier shook his head firmly, writing with conviction. "Not replacing." Adding, "Hearts expand. I've learned that from you. I will always love Sarah and Emma, but I love you too, differently but just as deeply." It was the first time he had written the word love to her, though she had felt it in 100 unspoken ways over the months of their courtship. Tears of happiness filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When they kissed, it was a promise of healing, of a future built together from the broken pieces of the past. They were married in the small church of Red Rock Springs on a perfect June day. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church overflowing with well-wishers. Willow wore a simple white dress adorned with lace, and Xavier looked handsome and nervous in a new black suit. When Pastor Johnson asked for the vows, Willow spoke hers clearly, her voice steady with certainty. For Xavier's part, he had written his vows, which the pastor read aloud for him. The words were beautiful, a pledge of devotion, protection, and unwavering love that left few dry eyes in the congregation. At the reception that followed, held in the town square under a canopy of ribbons and flowers, the couple received congratulations from everyone. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been among the most vocal skeptics of their relationship, admitted they seemed well matched. "He looks at you like you hung the moon," she told Willow, patting her hand. "I was wrong about him not healing. You've done that, girl, sure as any doctor could." As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing under the stars, Willow and Xavier slipped away to sit on the steps of the church where their journey together had truly begun on Christmas Eve. "Are you happy?" Willow asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Xavier nodded, kissing the top of her head tenderly. He reached for his ever-present notebook and wrote, "Happier than I ever thought possible again." She smiled up at him. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence, watching the festivities from a distance. Then, without warning, one of the children at the celebration did something particularly amusing, causing Willow to burst into spontaneous laughter, the same bright, uninhibited sound that had first awakened something in Xavier's dormant heart. He stiffened beside her, a strange expression crossing his face. Willow turned to him, concerned. "Xavier, what's wrong?" He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes intense with some inner struggle. Then, to Willow's astonishment, he opened his mouth and spoke, his voice rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper but unmistakably clear. "I love you, Willow." The world seemed to stop. Willow gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. You spoke." Xavier looked as surprised as she felt. He swallowed hard, then tried again, the words coming slightly easier this time. "Your laugh, it woke me, again." Tears of joy spilled down Willow's cheeks as she threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, Xavier, I love you too, so much." He held her tightly, his own eyes damp with emotion. When they finally drew apart, he touched her face gently, as if memorizing every feature. "Thank you," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "for bringing me back to life." 5 years later, the Norris Ranch had transformed completely. The once modest cabin was now a comfortable home, expanded to accommodate a growing family. Fields that had been untended were now productive, yielding crops to supplement the income from Xavier's horses. which had gained a reputation throughout the territory for their quality and training. On the wide front porch, Willow sat in a rocking chair, nursing their second child, a daughter named Hope, just 3 months old. Nearby, their 3-year-old son, Samuel, played with wooden blocks under the watchful eye of his father. "Higher, Papa," Samuel demanded as Xavier added another block to the precarious tower. "Any higher and it will fall," Xavier warned, his voice now strong and rich, with only occasional hesitations when he was tired or stressed. The years of silence had left their mark, but like other scars, they had faded with time and love. "Then we'll build it again," Samuel declared confidently. Xavier smiled at his son's determination. "Yes, we will. That's what Norrises do, we rebuild." Willow caught his eye over Hope's downy head, sharing a private smile at the simple wisdom in his words. They had rebuilt indeed a family, a home, a life from the ashes of tragedy. As the sun began to set over the prairie, casting golden light across their land, Xavier settled onto the porch step beside Willow's chair. He reached up to stroke Hope's cheek, then let his hand rest on Willow's knee. "Happy?" he asked, the question he still posed regularly, as if needing reassurance that the joy they'd found was real and lasting. "Completely," Willow answered truthfully. "And you?" Xavier's gaze swept over their home, their children, finally coming to rest on her face, the woman whose laughter had awakened him from a nightmare of grief, whose love had given him a second chance at happiness. "More than words can say," he replied, and leaned up to kiss her as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. The cowboy who had once sat in silence every night now filled his evenings with stories for his children, with conversation and laughter shared with his wife, with the sounds of a life fully and gratefully lived. And though he spoke freely now, Xavier Norris never forgot the power of silence or the miracle of the laugh that had broken it.